Chapter 8 of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 8. That afternoon, our expedition, in 2 sections, moved forward. The first section comprised myself and all the mules. The second section was commanded by Professor Small, followed by Professor Van Twiller, armed with a tiny shotgun. William, loaded down with the ladies' toilet articles, skulked in the rear. I say skulked. There was no other word for it. "So you're a guide, are you?" observed Professor Small, when William, cap in hand, had approached her with well-meant advice. "The woods are full of lazy guides. Pick up those Gladstone bags. I'll do the guiding for this expedition." Made cautious by William's humiliation, I associated with the mules exclusively. Nevertheless, Professor Small had her hard eyes on me, and I realized she meant mischief. The encounter took place just as I, driving the 5 mules, entered the great mountain gateway, thrilled with anticipation, which almost amounted to foreboding. As I was about to set foot across the imaginary frontier which divided the world from the unknown land, Professor Small hailed me, and I halted until she came up. "As commander of this expedition," she said, somewhat out of breath, "I desire to be the first living creature who has ever set foot behind the Graham Glacier. Kindly step aside, young sir." "Madam," said I, rigid with disappointment, "my guide, William Spike, entered that unknown land a year ago." "He says he did," sneered Professor Small. "As you like," I replied, "but it is scarcely generous to forestall the person whose stupidity gave you the clue to this unexplored region." "You mean yourself?" she asked, with a stony stare. "I do," said I firmly. Her little hard eyes grew harder, and she clutched her umbrella until the steel ribs crackled. "Young man," she said insolently, "if I could have gotten rid of you, I should have done so the day I was appointed president. But Professor Farrago refused to resign unless your position was assured, subject, of course, to your good behavior. Frankly, I don't like you, and I consider your views on science ridiculous. And if an opportunity presents itself, I will be most happy to request your resignation. Kindly collect your mules and follow me." Mortified beyond measure, I collected my mules and followed my president into the strange country behind the Hudson Mountains. I, who had aspired to lead, compelled to follow in the rear, driving mules. The journey was monotonous at first, but we shortly ascended a ridge from which we could see, stretching out below us, the wilderness where, save the feet of William Spike, no human feet had passed. As for me, tingling with enthusiasm, I forgot my chagrin, I forgot the gross injustice, I forgot my mules. "Excelsior!" I cried, running up and down the ridge in uncontrollable excitement at the sublime spectacle of forest, mountain, and valley all set with little lakes. "Excelsior!" repeated an excited voice at my side, and Professor Van Twiller sprang to the ridge beside me, her eyes bright as stars. Exalted, inspired by the mysterious beauty of the view, we clasped hands and ran up and down the grassy ridge. "That will do," said Professor Small coldly, as we raced about like a pair of distracted kittens. The chilling voice broke the spell. I dropped Professor Van Twiller's hand and sat down on a boulder, aching with wrath. Late that afternoon we halted beside a tiny lake deep in the unknown wilderness, where purple and scarlet bergamot choked the shores, and the spruce partridge strutted fearlessly under our very feet. Here we pitched our 2 tents. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines. The lake glittered. Acres of golden brake perfumed the forest silence, broken only at rare intervals by the distant thunder of a partridge drumming. Professor Small ate heavily and retired to her tent to lie torpid until evening. William drove the unloaded mules into an intervale full of sun-cured, fragrant grasses. I sat down beside Professor Van Twiller. The wilderness is electric. Once within the influence of its currents, human beings become positively or negatively charged, violently attracting or repelling each other. "There is something the matter with this air," said Professor Van Twiller. "It makes me feel as though I were desperately enamored of the entire human race." She leaned back against a pine, smiling vaguely, and crossing one knee over the other. Now, I am not bold by temperament, and normally I fear ladies. Therefore it surprised me to hear myself begin a frivolous causerie, replying to her pretty epigrams with epigrams of my own, advancing to the borderland of badinage, fearlessly conducting her and myself over that delicate frontier to meet upon the terrain of undisguised flirtation. It was clear that she was out for a holiday. The seriousness and restraints of 22 years she had left behind her in the civilized world, and now, with a shrug of her young shoulders, she unloosened her burden of reticence, dignity, and responsibility, and let the whole load fall with a discreet thud. "Even hares go mad in March," she said seriously. "I know you intend to flirt with me, and I don't care. Anyway, there's nothing else to do, is there?" "Suppose," said I solemnly, "I should take you behind that big tree and attempt to kiss you." The prospect did not appear to appall her, so I looked around with that sneaking yet conciliatory caution peculiar to young men who are novices in the art. Before I had satisfied myself that neither William nor the mules were observing us, Professor Van Twiller rose to her feet and took a short step backward. "Let's set traps for a ding," she said. "Will you?" I looked at the big tree, undecided. "Come on," she said. "I'll show you how." And away we went into the woods, she leading, her kilts flashing through the golden half-light. Now, I had not the faintest notion how to trap the ding, but Professor Van Twiller asserted that it formerly fed on the tender tips of the spruce, quoting Darwin as her authority. So we gathered a bushel of spruce tips, piled them on the bank of a little stream, then built a miniature stockade around the bait, a foot high. I roofed this with hemlock, then laboriously whittled out and adjusted a swinging shutter for the entrance, setting it on springy twigs. "The ding, you know, was supposed to live in the water," she said, kneeling beside me over our trap. I took her little hand and thanked her for the information. "Doubtless," she said enthusiastically, "a ding will come out of the lake tonight to feed on our spruce tips. Then," she added, "we've got him." "True," I said earnestly, and pressed her fingers very gently. Her face was turned a little away. I don't remember what she said. I don't remember that she said anything. A faint rose tint stole over her cheek. A few moments later she said, "You must not do that again." It was quite late when we strolled back to camp. Long before we came in sight of the twin tents, we heard a deep voice bawling our names. It was Professor Small, and she pounced upon Dorothy and drove her ignominiously into the tent. "As for you," she said in hollow tones, "you may explain your conduct at once, or place your resignation at my disposal." But somehow or other I appeared to be temporarily lost to shame, and I only smiled at my infuriated president, and entered my own tent with a step that was distinctly frolicsome. "Billy," said I to William Spike, who regarded me morosely from the depths of the tent, "I'm going out to bag a mammoth tomorrow, so kindly clean my elephant gun, and bring an axe to chop out the tusks." That night Professor Small complained bitterly of the cooking, but as neither Dorothy nor I knew how to improve it, she revenged herself on us by eating everything on the table and retiring to bed, taking Dorothy with her. I could not sleep very well. The mosquitoes were intrusive, and Professor Small dreamed she was a pack of wolves and yelped in her sleep. "Bird, ain't she?" said William, roused from slumber by her weird noises. Dorothy, much frightened, crawled out of her tent, where her blanket mate still dreamed dyspeptically, and William and I made her comfortable by the campfire. It takes a pretty girl to look pretty half asleep in a blanket. "Are you sure you are quite well?" I asked her. To make sure, I tested her pulse. For an hour it varied more or less, but without alarming either of us. Then she went back to bed, and I sat alone by the campfire. Towards midnight I suddenly began to feel that strange, distant vibration that I had once before felt. As before, the vibration grew on the still air, increasing in volume until it became a sound, then died out into silence. I rose and stole into my tent. William, white as death, lay in his corner, weeping in his sleep. I roused him remorselessly, and he sat up scowling, but refused to tell me what he had been dreaming. "Was it about that third thing you saw?" I began, but he snarled up at me like a startled animal, and I was obliged to go to bed and toss about and speculate. The next morning it rained. Dorothy and I visited our ding trap, but found nothing in it. We were inclined, however, to stay out in the rain behind a big tree, but Professor Small vetoed that proposition and sent me off to supply the larder with fresh meat. I returned, mad and wet, with a dozen partridges and a white hare, brown at that season, and William cooked them vilely. "I can taste the feathers," said Professor Small indignantly. "There is no accounting for taste," I said with a polite gesture of deprecation. "Personally, I find feathers unpalatable." "You may hand in your resignation this evening," cried Professor Small in hollow tones of passion. I passed her the pancakes with a cheerful smile, and flippantly pressed the hand next me. Unexpectedly, it proved to be William's sticky fist, and Dorothy and I laughed until her tears ran into Professor Small's coffee cup, an accident which kindled her wrath to red heat, and she requested my resignation 5 times during the evening. The next day it rained again, more or less. Professor Small complained of the cooking, demanded my resignation, and finally marched out to explore, lugging the reluctant William with her. Dorothy and I sat down behind the largest tree we could find. I don't remember what we were saying when a peculiar sound interrupted us, and we listened earnestly. It was like a bell in the woods. Ding-dong, ding-dong, ding-dong. A low, mellow, golden harmony, coming nearer, then stopping. I clasped Dorothy in my arms in my excitement. "It is the note of the ding," I whispered, and that explains its name, handed down from remote ages, along with the names of the behemoth and the coney. It was because of its bell-like cry that it was named. Darling, I cried, forgetting our short acquaintance, we have made a discovery that the whole world will ring with. Hand in hand, we tiptoed through the forest to our trap. There was something in it that took fright at our approach, and rushed panic-stricken round and round the interior of the trap, uttering its alarm note, which sounded like the jangling of a whole string of bells. I seized the strangely beautiful creature. It neither attempted to bite nor scratch, but crouched in my arms, trembling and eyeing me. Delighted with the lovely tame animal, we bore it tenderly back to the camp and placed it on my blanket. Hand in hand we stood before it, awed by the sight of this beast, so long believed to be extinct. "It is too good to be true," sighed Dorothy, clasping her white hands under her chin and gazing at the ding in rapture. "Yes," said I solemnly, "you and I, my child, are face to face with the fabled ding, Dingus solitarius. Let us continue to gaze at it, reverently, prayerfully, humbly." Dorothy yawned, probably with excitement. We were still mutely adoring the ding when Professor Small burst into the tent at a hand gallop, bawling hoarsely for her kodak and notebook. Dorothy seized her triumphantly by the arm and pointed at the ding, which appeared to be frightened to death. "What?" cried Professor Small scornfully. "That a ding? Rubbish!" "Madam," I said firmly, "it is a ding. It's a monodactyl. See, it has but a single toe." "Bosh!" she retorted. "It's got 4. "4?" I repeated blankly. "Yes, 1 on each foot." "Of course," I said, "you didn't suppose a monodactyl meant a beast with 1 leg and 1 toe?" But she laughed hatefully and declared it was a woodchuck. We squabbled for a while, until I saw the significance of her attitude. The unfortunate woman wished to find a ding first and be accredited with the discovery. I lifted the ding in both hands and shook the creature gently, until the chiming ding-dong of its protestations filled our ears like sweet bells jangled out of tune. Pale with rage at this final proof of the ding's identity, she seized her camera and notebook. "I haven't any time to waste over that musical woodchuck," she shouted, and bounced out of the tent. "What have you discovered, dear?" cried Dorothy, running after her. "A mammoth!" bawled Professor Small triumphantly, "and I'm going to photograph him." Neither Dorothy nor I believed her. We watched the flight of the infatuated woman in silence. And now, at last, the tragic shadow falls over my paper as I write. I was never passionately attached to Professor Small, yet I would gladly refrain from chronicling the episode that must follow, if, as I have hitherto attempted, I succeed in sticking to the unornamented truth. I have said that neither Dorothy nor I believed her. I don't know why, unless it was that we had not yet made up our minds to believe that the mammoth still existed on Earth. So, when Professor Small disappeared in the forest, scuttling through the underbrush like a demoralized hen, we viewed her flight with unconcern. There was a large tree in the neighborhood, a pleasant shelter in case of rain, so we sat down behind it, although the sun was shining fiercely. It was one of those peaceful afternoons in the wilderness when the whole forest dreams, and the shadows are asleep, and every little leaflet takes a nap. Under the still treetops, the dappled sunlight, motionless, soaked the sod. The forest flies no longer whirled in circles, but sat sunning their wings on slender twig tips. The heat was sweet and spicy. The sun drew out the delicate essence of gum and sap, warming volatile juices until they exhaled through the aromatic bark. The sun went down into the wilderness. The forest stirred in its sleep. A fish splashed in the lake. The spell was broken. Presently the wind began to rise somewhere far away in the unknown land. I heard it coming nearer, nearer. A brisk wind that grew heavier and blew harder as it neared us. A gale that swept distant branches. A furious gale that set limbs clashing and cracking nearer and nearer. Crack! And the gale grew to a hurricane, trampling trees like dead twigs. Crack! Crackle! Crash! Crash! Was it the wind? With the roaring in my ears, I sprang up, staring into the forest vista. And at the same instant, out of the crashing forest, sped Professor Small, skirts tucked up, thin legs flying like bicycle spokes. I shouted, but the crashing drowned my voice. Then, all at once, the solid earth began to shake, and with the rush and roar of a tornado, a gigantic living thing burst out of the forest before our eyes. A vast shadowy bulk that rocked and rolled along, mowing down trees in its course. Two great crescents of ivory curved from its head. Its back swept through the tossing treetops. Once it bellowed like a gun fired from a high bastion. The apparition passed with the noise of thunder rolling on towards the ends of the earth. Crack! Crash! went the trees. The tempest swept away in a rolling volley of reports, distant, more distant, until long after the tumult had deadened, then ceased. The stunned forest echoed with the fall of mangled branches slowly dropping. That evening, an agitated young couple sat close together in the deserted camp, calling timidly at intervals for Professor Small and William Spike. I say timidly because it is correct. We did not care to have a mammoth respond to our calls. The lurking echoes across the lake answered our cries. The full moon came up over the forest to look at us. We were not much to look at. Dorothy was moistening my shoulder with unfeigned tears, and I, afraid to light the fire, sat hunched up under the common blanket, wildly examining the darkness around us. Chilled to the spinal marrow, I watched the gray lights widen in the east. A single bird awoke in the wilderness. I saw the nearer trees looming in the mist and the silver fog rolling on the lake. All night long the darkness had vibrated with the strange monotone which I had heard the first night, camping at the gate of the unknown land. My brain seemed to echo that subtle harmony which rings in the auricular labyrinth after sound has ceased. There are ghosts of sound which return to haunt long after sound is dead. It was these voiceless spectres of a voice long dead that stirred the transparent silence, intoning toneless tones. I think I make myself clear. It was an uncanny night. Morning whitened the east. Gray daylight stole into the woods, blotting the shadows to paler tints. It was nearly midday before the sun became visible through the fine-spun web of mist, a pale spot of guilt in the zenith. By this pallid light, I labored to strike the 2 empty tents, gather up our equipments, and pack them on our 5 mules. Dorothy aided me bravely, whimpering when I spoke of Professor Small and William Spike, but abating nothing of her industry until we had the mules loaded, and I was ready to drive them, heaven knows whither. "Where shall we go?" quavered Dorothy, sitting on a log with the ding in her lap. One thing was certain. This mammoth-ridden land was no place for women, and I told her so. We placed the ding in a basket and tied it around the leading mule's neck. Immediately the ding, alarmed, began dingling like a cowbell. It acted like a charm on the other mules, and they gravely filed off after their leader, following the bell. Dorothy and I, hand in hand, brought up the rear. I shall never forget that scene in the forest. The gray arch of the heavens swimming in mist, through which the sun peered shiftily, the tall pines wavering through the fog, the preoccupied mules marching single file, the foggy bell note of the gentle ding in its swinging basket, and Dorothy, limp kilts dripping with dew, plodding through the white dusk. We followed the terrible tornado path which the mammoth had left in its wake, but there were no traces of its human victims, neither one jot of Professor Small, nor one solitary tittle of William Spike. And now I would be glad to end this chapter if I could. I would gladly leave myself as I was, there in the misty forest, with an arm encircling the slender body of my little companion, and the mules moving in a monotonous line, and the ding discreetly jingling. But again that menacing shadow falls across my page, and truth bids me tell all, and I, the slave of accuracy, must remember my vows as the dauntless disciple of truth. Towards sunset, or that pale parody of sunset which set the forest swimming in a ghastly, colorless haze, the mammoth's trail of ruin brought us suddenly out of the trees to the shore of a great sheet of water. It was a desolate spot. Northward a chaos of somber peaks rose, piled up like thunderclouds along the horizon. East and south the darkening wilderness spread like a pall. Westward, crawling out into the mist from our very feet, the gray waste of water moved under the dull sky, and flat waves slapped the squatting rocks, heavy with slime. And now I understood why the trail of the mammoth continued straight into the lake, for on either hand black, filthy tamarack swamps lay under ghostly sheets of mist. I strove to creep out into the bog, seeking a footing, but the swamp quaked and the smooth surface trembled like jelly in a bowl. A stick thrust into the slime sank into unknown depths. Vaguely alarmed, I gained the firm land again and looked around, believing there was no road open but the desolate trail we had traversed. But I was in error. Already the leading mule was wading out into the water, and the others, one by one, followed. How wide the lake might be we could not tell, because the band of fog hung across the water like a curtain. Yet out into this flat, shallow void our mules went steadily, slop, 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 in single file. Already they were growing indistinct in the fog, so I bade Dorothy hasten and take off her shoes and stockings. She was ready before I was, I having to unlace my shooting boots, and she stepped out into the water, kilts fluttering, moving her white feet cautiously. In a moment I was beside her, and we waded forward, sounding the shallow water with our poles. When the water had risen to Dorothy's knees, I hesitated, alarmed. But when we attempted to retrace our steps, we could not find the shore again, for the blank mist shrouded everything, and the water deepened at every step. I halted and listened for the mules. Far away in the fog I heard a dull splashing, receding as I listened. After a while all sound died away, and a slow horror stole over me, a horror that froze the little network of veins in every limb. A step to the right, and the water rose to my knees. A step to the left, and the cold, thin circle of the flood chilled my breast. Suddenly Dorothy screamed, and the next moment a far cry answered. A far, sweet cry that seemed to come from the sky, like the rushing harmony of the world's swift winds. Then the curtain of fog before us lightened up from behind. Shadows moved on the misty screen, outlines of trees and grassy shores, and tiny birds flying. Thrown on the vapory curtain, in silhouette, a man and a woman passed under the lovely trees, arms about each other's necks. Near them, the shadows of 5 mules grazed peacefully. A ding gamboled close by. "It is a mirage," I muttered, but my voice made no sound. Slowly the light behind the fog died out. The vapor around us turned to rose, then dissolved, while mile on mile of a limitless sea spread away, till, like a quick line penciled at a stroke, the horizon cut sky and sea in half, and before us lay an ocean from which towered a mountain of snow, or a gigantic berg of milky ice, for it was moving. "Good heavens!" I shrieked. "It is alive!" At the sound of my crazed cry, the mountain of snow became a pillar, towering to the clouds, and a wave of golden glory drenched the figure to its knees. Figure? Yes, for a colossal arm shot across the sky, then curved back in exquisite grace to a head of awful beauty. A woman's head, with eyes like the blue lake of heaven. Aye, a woman's splendid form, upright from the sky to the earth, knee-deep in the sea. The evening clouds drifted across her brow. Her shimmering hair lighted the world beneath with sunset. Then, shading her white brow with one hand, she bent, and with the other hand dipped in the sea, she sent a wave rolling at us. Straight out of the horizon it sped, a ripple that grew to a wave, then to a furious breaker, which caught us up in a whirl of foam, bearing us onward, faster, faster, swiftly flying through leagues of spray, until consciousness ceased and all was blank. Yet ere my senses fled, I heard again that strange cry, that sweet, thrilling harmony rushing out over the foaming waters, filling earth and sky with its soundless vibrations. And I knew it was the hail of the spirit of the north, warning us back to life again. Looking back now over the days that passed before we staggered into the Hudson Bay outpost at Gravel Cove, I am inclined to believe that neither Dorothy nor I were clothed entirely in our proper minds. Or, if we were, our minds, no doubt, must have been in the same condition as our clothing. I remember shooting ptarmigan, and that we ate them. Flashes of memory recall the steady downpour of rain through the endless twilight of shaggy forests, dim days on the foggy tundra, mud-holes from which the wild ducks rose in thousands. Then the stunted hemlocks, then the forest again. And I do not even recall the moment when at last, stumbling into the smooth path left by the Graham Glacier, we crawled through the mountain wall, out of the unknown land, and once more into a world protected by the Lord Almighty. A hunting party of Elban Indians brought us in to the post, and everybody was most kind. That I remember, just before going into several weeks of unpleasant delirium, mercifully mitigated with unconsciousness. Curiously enough, Professor Van Twiller was not very much battered physically, for I had carried her for days pick-a-back. But the awful experience had produced a shock which resulted in a nervous condition that lasted so long after she returned to New York that the wealthy and eminent specialist who attended her insisted upon taking her to the Riviera and marrying her. I sometimes wonder, but as I have said, such reflections have no place in these austere pages. However, Anybody, I fancy, is at liberty to speculate upon the fate of the late Professor Small and William Spike, and upon the mules and the gentle Ding. Personally, I am convinced that the suggestive silhouettes I saw on that ghastly curtain of fog were cast by beatified beings in some earthly paradise, a mirage of bliss of which we caught but the colorless shadow shapes floating twixt sea and sky. At all events, neither Professor Small nor William Spike ever returned. No exploring expedition has found a trace of mule or lady, of William or the Ding. The new expedition to be organized by Barnard College may penetrate still farther. I suppose that, when the time comes, I shall be expected to volunteer. But Professor Van Twiller is married, and William and Professor Small ought to be, and altogether, considering the mammoth and that gigantic and splendid apparition that bent from the zenith to the ocean and sent a tidal wave rolling from the palm of one white hand, I say, taking all these various matters under consideration, I think I shall decide to remain in New York and continue writing for the scientific periodicals. Besides, the mortifying experience at the Paris Exposition has dampened even my perennially youthful enthusiasm. And as for the late expedition to Florida, heaven knows I am ready to repeat it. Nay, I am already forming a plan for the rescue. But though I am prepared to encounter any danger for the sake of my beloved superior, Professor Farrago, I do not feel inclined to commit indiscretions in order to pry into secrets which, as I regard it, concern Professor Small and William Spike alone. But all this is in a measure premature. What I now have to relate is the recital of an eyewitness to that most astonishing scandal which occurred during the recent exposition in Paris. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 9. When the delegates were appointed to the International Scientific Congress at the Paris Exposition of 1900, how little did anybody imagine that the great conference would end in the most gigantic scandal that ever stirred two continents. Yet, had it not been for the pair of American newspapers published in Paris, this scandal would never have been aired, for the continental press is so well muzzled that when it bites, its teeth merely meet in the empty atmosphere with a discreet snap. But to the Yankee, nothing excepting the Monroe Doctrine is sacred, and the unsopped watchdogs of the press bite right and left unmuzzled. The biter bites. It is his profession, and that ends the affair. The bitee is bidden, and in the deplorable argot of the hour, it is up to him. So now that the scandal has been well aired and hung out to dry in the teeth of decency and the four winds, and as all the details have been cheerfully and grossly exaggerated, it is, perhaps, the proper moment for the truth to be written, by the only person whose knowledge of all the facts in the affair entitles him to speak for himself as well as for those honorable ladies and gentlemen whose names and titles have been so mercilessly criticized. These, then, are the simple facts. The International Scientific Congress, now adjourned sine die, met at 9 o'clock in the morning, May 3rd, 1900, in the Tasmanian Pavilion of the Paris Exposition. There were present the most famous scientists of Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, Switzerland, and the United States. His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince of Monaco, presided. It is not necessary now to repeat the details of that preliminary meeting. It is sufficient to say that committees representing the various known sciences were named and appointed by the Prince of Monaco, who had been unanimously elected permanent chairman of the conference. It is the composition of a single committee that concerns us now, and that committee, representing the science which treats of bird life, was made up as follows. Chairman, His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince of Monaco. Members, Sir Peter Grebe, Great Britain. Baron de Bécas, France. His Royal Highness King Kristin of Finland. The Countess d'Alzette of Belgium. And I, from the United States, representing the Smithsonian Institution and the Bronx Park Zoological Society of New York. This, then, was the composition of that now notorious ornithological committee, a modest, earnest, self-effacing little band of workers, bound together, in the beginning, by those ties of mutual respect and esteem which unite all laborers in the vineyard of science. From the first meeting of our committee, science, the great leveler, left no artificial barriers of rank or title standing between us. We were enthusiasts in our love for ornithology. We found new inspiration in the democracy of our common interests. As for me, I chatted with my fellows, feeling no restraint myself and perceiving none. The King of Finland and I discussed his latest monograph on the speckled titmouse, and I was glad to agree with the king in all his theories concerning the nesting habits of that important bird. Sir Peter Grebe, a large red gentleman in tweeds, read us some notes he had made on the domestic hen and her reasons for running ahead of a horse and wagon instead of stepping aside to let the disturbing vehicle pass. The Crown Prince of Monaco took issue with Sir Peter. So did the Baron de Bécas, and we were entertained by a friendly and marvelously interesting three-cornered dispute, shared in by three of the most profound thinkers of the century. I shall never forget the brilliancy of that argument, nor the modest, good-humored retorts which gave us all a glimpse into depths of erudition which impressed us profoundly, and set the seal on the bonds which held us so closely together. Alas, that the seal should ever have been broken! Alas, that the glittering apple of discord should have been flung into our midst! No, not flung, but gently rolled under our noses, by the gloved fingers of the lovely Countess d'Alzette. Monsieur, said the fair Countess, when all present, excepting she and I, had touched upon or indicated the subjects which they had prepared to present to the Congress. Messieurs mes confrères, I have been requested by our distinguished chairman, the Crown Prince of Monaco, to submit to your judgment the subject which, by favour of the King of the Belgians, I have prepared to present to the International Scientific Congress. She made a pretty curtsy as she named her own sovereign, and we all rose out of respect to that most austere and moral ruler, the King of Belgium. But, she said, with a charming smile of depreciation, I am very, very much afraid that the subject which I have chosen may not meet with your approval, gentlemen. She stood there in her dainty Parisian gown and bonnet, shaking her pretty head uncertainly, a smile on her lips, her small gloved fingers interlocked. Oh, I know how dreadful it would be if this great Congress should be compelled to listen to any hoax like that which Monsieur de Rougemont imposed on the British Royal Society, she said gravely, and because the subject of my paper is as strange as the strangest phenomenon alleged to have been noted by Monsieur de Rougemont, I hesitate. She glanced at the silent listeners around her. Sir Peter's red face had hardened. The King of Finland frowned slightly. The Crown Prince of Monaco and Baron de Bécas wore anxious smiles. But when her violet eyes met mine, I gave her a glance of encouragement, and that glance, I am forced to confess, was not dictated by scientific approval, but by something that never entirely dries up in the mustiest and dustiest of savants, the old Adam implanted in us all. Now, I knew perfectly well what her subject must be. So did every man present, for it was no secret that His Majesty of Belgium had been swindled by some natives in Tasmania, and had paid a very large sum of money for a skin of that gigantic bird, the ox, which has been so often reported to exist among the inaccessible peaks of the Tasmanian mountains. Needless, perhaps, to say that the skin proved a fraud, being nothing more than a Barnum contrivance made up out of the skins of a dozen ostriches and cassowaries, and most cleverly put together by Chinese workmen. At least, such was the report made on it by Sir Peter Grebe, who had been sent by the British Society to Antwerp to examine the acquisition. Needless also, perhaps, to say that King Leopold of Belgium stoutly maintained that the skin of the ox was genuine from beak to claw. For 6 months there had been a most serious difference of opinion among European ornithologists concerning the famous ox in the Antwerp Museum, and this difference had promised to result in an open quarrel between a few Belgian savants on one side and all Europe and Great Britain on the other. Scientists have a deep-rooted horror of anything that touches on charlatanism. The taint of trickery not only alarms them, but drives them away from any suspicious subject, and usually ruins, scientifically speaking, the person who has introduced the subject for discussion. Therefore, it took no little courage for the Countess d'Alzette to touch, with her dainty gloves, a subject which every scientist in Europe, with scarcely an exception, had pronounced fraudulent and unworthy of investigation. And to bring it before the great International Congress required more courage still, for the person who could face, in executive session, the most brilliant intellects in the world, and openly profess faith in a Barnumized bird-skin, either had no scientific reputation to lose, or was possessed of a bravery far above that of the savants who composed the audience. Now, when the pretty Countess caught a flash of encouragement in my glance, she turned rosy with gratification and surprise. Clearly, she had not expected to find a single ally in the entire Congress. Her quick smile of gratitude touched me, and made me ashamed, too, for I had encouraged her out of the pure love of mischief, hoping to hear the whole matter threshed before the Congress, and so have it settled once for all. It was a thoughtless thing to do on my part. I should have remembered the consequences to the Countess if it were proven that she had been championing a fraud. The ruffled dignity of the Congress would never forgive her. Her scientific career would practically be at an end, because her theories and observations could no longer command respect or even the attention of those who knew that she herself had once been deceived by a palpable fraud. I looked at her guiltily, already ashamed of myself for encouraging her to her destruction. How lovely and innocent she appeared, standing there reading her notes in a low, clear voice, fresh as a child's, with now and then a delicious upward sweep of her long, dark lashes. With a start, I came to my senses, and bestowed a pinch on myself. This was neither the time nor the place to sentimentalize over a girlish beauty whose small Parisian head was crammed full of foolish, brave theories concerning an imposition which her aged sovereign had been unable to detect. I saw the gathering frown on the King of Finland's dark face. I saw Sir Peter Grebe grow redder and redder, and press his thick lips together to control the angry "bosh," which need not have been uttered to have been understood. The Baron de Becas wore a painfully neutral smile, which froze his face into a quaint gargoyle. The Crown Prince of Monaco looked at his polished fingernails with a startled yet abstracted resignation. Clearly, the young Countess had not a sympathizer in the committee. Something, perhaps it was the latent chivalry which exists embedded in us all, perhaps it was pity, perhaps a glimmering dawn of belief in the uck-skin, set my thoughts working very quickly. The Countess d'Alzette finished her notes, then glanced around with a deprecating smile, which died out on her lips when she perceived the silent and stony hostility of her fellow scientists. A quick expression of alarm came into her lovely eyes. Would they vote against giving her a hearing before the Congress? It required a unanimous vote to reject the subject. She turned her eyes on me. I rose, red as fire, my head humming with a chaos of ideas, all disordered and vague, yet whirling along in a single resistless current. I had come to the Congress prepared to deliver a monograph on the great auk. But now the subject went overboard, as the birds themselves had, and I found myself pleading with the committee to give the Countess a hearing on the ucks. "Why not?" I exclaimed warmly. "It is established beyond question that the ucks does exist in Tasmania. Wallace saw several uxen through his telescope, walking about upon the inaccessible heights of the Tasmanian mountains. Darwin acknowledged that the bird exists. Professor Farrago has published a pamphlet containing an accumulation of all data bearing upon the ucks. Why should not Madame la Comtesse be heard by the entire Congress?" I looked at Sir Peter Grebe. "Have you seen this alleged bird skin in the Antwerp Museum?" he asked, perspiring with indignation. "Yes, I have," said I. "It has been patched up, but how are we to know that the skin did not require patching? I have not found that ostrich skin has been used. It is true that the Tasmanians may have shot the bird to pieces and mended the skin with bits of cassowary hide here and there, but the greater part of the skin and the beak and claws are, in my estimation, well worth the serious attention of savants. To pronounce them fraudulent is, in my opinion, rash and premature." I mopped my brow. I was in for it now. I had thrown in my reputation with the reputation of the Countess. The displeasure and astonishment of my confrères was unmistakable. In the midst of a strained silence, I moved that a vote be taken upon the advisability of a hearing before the Congress on the subject of the ucks. After a pause, the young Countess, pale and determined, seconded my motion. The result of the balloting was a foregone conclusion. The Countess had one vote, she herself refraining from voting, and the subject was entered on the committee book as acceptable and a date set for the hearing before the International Congress. The effect of this vote on our little committee was most marked. Constraint took the place of cordiality. Polite reserve replaced that guileless and open-hearted courtesy with which our proceedings had begun. With icy politeness, the Crown Prince of Monaco asked me to state the subject of the paper I proposed to read before the Congress, and I replied quietly that, as I was partly responsible for advocating the discussion of the ucks, I proposed to associate myself with the Countess d'Alzette in that matter, if Madame la Comtesse would accept the offer of a brother savant. "Indeed I will," she said impulsively, her blue eyes soft with gratitude. "Very well," observed Sir Peter Grebe, swallowing his indignation and waddling off towards the door. "I shall resign my position on this committee. Yes, I will, I tell you," as the King of Finland laid a fatherly hand on Sir Peter's sleeve. "I'll not be made responsible for this damn—" He choked, sputtered, then bowed to the horrified countess, asking pardon, and declaring that he yielded to nobody in respect for the gentler sex, and he retired with the Baron de Bécas. But out in the hallway I heard him explode. "Confound it! This is no place for petticoats, Baron! And as for that Yankee ornithologist, he's hung himself with the Countess's corset string. Yes, he has. Don't tell me, Baron. The young idiot was all right until the Countess looked at him, I tell you. Gad, how she crumpled him up with those blue eyes of hers. What the devil do women come into such committees for, eh? It's an outrage, I tell you. Why, the whole world will jeer at us if we sit and listen to her monograph on that fraudulent bird." The young Countess, who was writing near the window, could not have heard this outburst. But I heard it, and so did King Kristin and the Crown Prince of Monaco. "Lord," thought I, "the Countess and I are in the frying pan this time. I'll do what I can to keep us both out of the fire." When the King and the Crown Prince had made their adieu to the Countess, and she had responded, pale and serious, they came over to where I was standing, looking out on the Seine. "Though we must differ from you," said the King kindly, "we wish you all success in this dangerous undertaking." I thanked him. "You are a young man to risk a reputation already established," remarked the Crown Prince, then added, "You are braver than I. Ridicule is a barrier to all knowledge, and though we know that, we seekers after truth always bring up short at that barrier and dismount, not daring to put our hobbies to the fence." "One can but come a cropper," said I. "And risk staking our hobbies? No, no, that would make us ridiculous, and ridicule kills in Europe." "It's somewhat deadly in America, too," I said, smiling. "The more honor to you," said the Crown Prince gravely. "Oh, I am not the only one," I answered lightly. "There is my confrère, Professor Hyssop, who studies apparitions and braves a contempt and ridicule which none of us would dare challenge. We Yankees are learning slowly. Some day we will find the lost key to the future, while Europe is sneering at those who are trying to pick the lock." When King Kristin of Finland and the Crown Prince of Monaco had taken their hats and sticks and departed, I glanced across the room at the young Countess, who was now working rapidly on a typewriter, apparently quite oblivious of my presence. I looked out of the window again, and my gaze wandered over the Exposition grounds. Gilt and scarlet and azure, the palaces rose in every direction under a wilderness of fluttering flags. Towers, minarets, turrets, golden spires cut the blue sky. In the west, the gaunt Eiffel Tower sprawled across the glittering esplanade. Behind it rose the solid golden dome of the Emperor's tomb, gilded once more by the almighty sun, to amuse the living rabble, while the dead slumbered in his imperial crypt, himself now but a relic for the amusement of the people whom he had despised. O tempora, O mores, O Napoleon! Down under my window, in the asphalted court, the King of Finland was entering his beautiful Victoria. An adjutant, wearing a cocked hat and brilliant uniform, mounted the box beside the green and gold coachman. The 2 postilions straightened up in their saddles. The 4 horses danced. Then, when the Crown Prince of Monaco had taken a seat beside the king, the carriage rolled away, and far down the quay I watched it, until the flutter of the green and white plumes in the adjutant's cocked hat was all I could see of vanishing royalty. I was still musing there by the window, listening to the click and ringing of the typewriter, when I suddenly became aware that the clicking had ceased, and turning I saw the young Countess standing beside me. "Thank you for your chivalrous impulse to help me," she said frankly, holding out her bare hand. I bent over it. "I had not realized how desperate my case was," she said with a smile. "I supposed that they would at least give me a hearing. How can I thank you for your brave vote in my favor?" "By giving me your confidence in this matter," said I gravely. "If we are to win, we must work together, and work hard, madame. We are entering a struggle, not only to prove the genuineness of a bird skin and the existence of a bird which neither of us has ever seen, but also a struggle which will either make us famous forever or render it impossible for either of us ever again to face a scientific audience." "I know it," she said quietly, "and I understand all the better how gallant a gentleman I have had the fortune to enlist in my cause. Believe me, had I not absolute confidence in my ability to prove the existence of the ox, I should not, selfish as I am, have accepted your chivalrous offer to stand or fall with me." The subtle emotion in her voice touched a responsive chord in me. I looked at her earnestly. She raised her beautiful eyes to mine. "Will you help me?" she asked. Would I help her? Faith, I'd pass the balance of my life turning flip-flaps to please her. I did not attempt to undeceive myself. I realized that the lightning had struck me, that I was desperately in love with the young countess, from the tip of her bonnet to the toe of her small polished shoe. I was curiously cool about it too, although my heart gave a thump that nigh choked me, and I felt myself going red from temple to chin. If the Countess d'Alzette noticed it, she gave no sign, unless the pink tint under her eyes, deepening, was a subtle signal of understanding to the signal in my eyes. "Suppose," she said, "that I failed before the Congress to prove my theory. Suppose my investigations resulted in the exposure of a fraud, and my name was held up to ridicule before all Europe. What would become of you, monsieur?" I was silent. "You are already celebrated as the discoverer of the mammoth and the great auk," she persisted. "You are young, enthusiastic, renowned, and you have a future before you that anybody in the world might envy." I said nothing. "And yet," she said softly, "you risk all, because you will not leave a young woman friendless among her confreres. It is not wise, monsieur. It is gallant and generous and impulsive, but it is not wisdom. Don Quixote rides no more in Europe, my friend." "He stays at home, 70 million of him, in America," said I. After a moment she said, "I believe you, monsieur." "It is true enough," I said with a laugh. "We are the only people who tilt at windmills these days. We and our cousins, the British, who taught us." I bowed gaily and added, "With your colors to wear, I shall have the honor of breaking a lance against the biggest windmill in the world." "You mean the citadel of science," she said, smiling. "And its rock-ribbed respectability," I replied. She looked at me thoughtfully, rolling and unrolling the scroll in her hands. Then she sighed, smiled, and brightened, handing me the scroll. "Read it carefully," she said. "It is an outline of the policy I suggest that we follow. You will be surprised at some of the statements, yet every word is the truth. And, monsieur, your reward for the devotion you have offered will be no greater than you deserve, when you find yourself doubly famous for our joint monograph on the ox. Without your vote in the committee, I should have been denied a hearing, even though I produced proofs to support my theory. I appreciate that. I do most truly appreciate the courage which prompted you to defend a woman at the risk of your own ruin. Come to me this evening at 9. I hold for you in store a surprise and pleasure which you do not dream of." Ah, "But I do," I said slowly, under the spell of her delicate beauty and enthusiasm. "How can you?" she said, laughing. "You don't know what awaits you at 9 this evening." "You," I said, fascinated. The color swept her face. She dropped me a deep curtsy. "At 9, then," she said. "Number 8, Rue de Alouette." I bowed, took my hat, gloves, and stick, and attended her to her carriage below. Long after the blue and black Victoria had whirled away down the crowded quay, I stood looking after it, mazed in the web of that ancient enchantment, whose spell fell over the first man in Eden, and whose sorcery shall not fail till the last man returns his soul. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 10. I lunched at my lodgings on the Quai Malthus, and I had but little appetite, having fed upon such an unexpected variety of emotions during the morning. Now, although I was already heels over head in love, I do not believe that loss of appetite was the result of that alone. I was slowly beginning to realize what my recent attitude might cost me, not only in an utter collapse of my scientific career and the consequent material ruin which was likely to follow, but in the loss of all my friends at home. The Zoological Society of Bronx Park and the Smithsonian Institution of Washington had sent me as their trusted delegate, leaving it entirely to me to choose the subject on which I was to speak before the International Congress. What, then, would be their attitude when they learned that I had chosen to uphold the dangerous theory of the existence of the ox? Would they repudiate me and send another delegate to replace me? Would they merely wash their hands of me and let me go to my own destruction? I will know soon enough, thought I, for this morning's proceedings will have been cabled to New York ere now, and read at the breakfast tables of every old moss-grown naturalist in America before I see the Countess d'Alzette this evening. And I drew from my pocket the roll of paper which she had given me, and lighting a cigar, lay back in my chair to read it. The manuscript had been beautifully typewritten, and I had no trouble in following her brief, clear account of the circumstances under which the notorious uckskin had been obtained. As for the story itself, it was somewhat fishy, but I manfully swallowed my growing nervousness, and comforted myself with the belief of Darwin in the existence of the ox, and the subsequent testimony of Wallace, who simply stated what he had seen through his telescope, and then left it to others to identify the enormous birds he described as he had observed them stalking about on the snowy peaks of the Tasmanian Alps. My own knowledge of the ox was confined to a single circumstance. When, in 1897, I had gone to Tasmania with Professor Farrago to make a report on the availability of the so-called Tasmanian devil as a substitute for the mongoose in the West Indies, I of course heard a great deal of talk among the natives concerning the birds which they affirmed haunted the summits of the mountains. Our time in Tasmania was too limited to admit of an exploration then. But although we were perfectly aware that the summits of the Tasmanian Alps were inaccessible, we certainly should have attempted to gain them, had not the time set for our departure arrived before we had completed the investigation for which we were sent. One relic, however, I carried away with me. It was a single greenish-bronzed feather, found high up in the mountains by a native, and sold to me for a somewhat large sum of money. Darwin believed the ox to be covered with greenish plumage. Wallace was too far away to observe the color of the great birds, but all the natives of Tasmania unite in affirming that the plumage of the uks is green. It was not only the color of this feather that made me an eager purchaser. It was the extraordinary length and size. I knew of no living bird large enough to wear such a feather. As for the color, that might have been tampered with before I bought it, and indeed, testing it later, I found on the fronds traces of sulfate of copper. But the same thing has been found in the feathers of certain birds whose color is metallic green, and it has been proven that such birds pick up and swallow shining bits of copper pyrites. Why should not the uks do the same thing? Still, my only reason for believing in the existence of the bird was this single feather. I had easily proved that it belonged to no known species of bird. I also proved it to be similar to the tail feathers of the uckskin in Antwerp. But the feathers on the Antwerp specimen were gray, and the longest of them was but 3 feet in length, while my huge bronze-green feather measured 11 feet from tip to tip. One might account for it, supposing the Antwerp skin to be that of a young bird, or of a molting bird, or perhaps of a different sex from the bird whose feather I had secured. Still, these ideas were not proven. Nothing concerning the birds had been proven. I had but a single fact to lean on, and that was that the feather I possessed could not have belonged to any known species of bird. Nobody but myself knew of the existence of this feather. And now I meant to cable to Bronx Park for it, and to place this evidence at the disposal of the beautiful Countess d'Alzette. My cigar had gone out as I sat musing, and I relighted it and resumed my reading of the typewritten notes, lazily, even a trifle skeptically, for all the evidence that she had been able to collect to substantiate her theory of the existence of the uks was not half as important as the evidence I was to produce in the shape of that enormous green feather. I came to the last paragraph, smoking serenely and leaning back comfortably, one leg crossed over the other. Then, suddenly, my attention became riveted on the words under my eyes. Could I have read them aright? Could I believe what I read in ever-growing astonishment, which culminated in an excitement that stirred the very hair on my head? The uks exists. There is no longer room for doubt. Ocular proof I can now offer in the shape of 5 living eggs of this gigantic bird. All measures have been taken to hatch these eggs. They are now in the vast incubator. It is my plan to have them hatch one by one under the very eyes of the International Congress. It will be the greatest triumph that science has witnessed since the discovery of the New World. Signed, Suzanne d'Alzette. Either, I cried out in uncontrollable excitement, either that girl is mad, or she is the cleverest woman on earth. After a moment, I added, in either event, I am going to marry her. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 11. That evening, a few minutes before 9 o'clock, I descended from a cab in front of number 8 Rue de Alouette, and was ushered into a pretty reception room by an irreproachable servant, who disappeared directly with my card. In a few moments the young countess came in, exquisite in her silvery dinner gown, eyes bright, white arms extended in a charming, impulsive welcome. The touch of her silky fingers thrilled me. I was dumb under the enchantment of her beauty. And I think she understood my silence, for her blue eyes became troubled, and the happy parting of her lips changed to a pensive curve. Presently I began to tell her about my bronzed green feather. At my first word she looked up brightly, almost gratefully, I fancied, and in another moment we were deep in eager discussion of the subject which had first drawn us together. What evidence I possessed to sustain our theory concerning the existence of the ox I hastened to reveal. Then, heart beating excitedly, I asked her about the eggs, and where they were at present, and whether she believed it possible to bring them to Paris. All these questions in the same breath, which brought a happy light into her eyes and a delicious ripple of laughter to her lips. "Why, of course it is possible to bring the eggs here," she cried. "Am I sure? Parbleu! The eggs are already here, monsieur." "Here?" I exclaimed. "In Paris?" "In Paris? Mais oui, and in my own house. This very house, monsieur. Come, you shall behold them with your own eyes." Her eyes were brilliant with excitement. Impulsively she stretched out her rosy hand. I took it, and she led me quickly back through the drawing-room, through the dining-room, across the butler's pantry, and into a long dark hallway. We were almost running now, I keeping tight hold of her soft little hand, she raising her gown a trifle, hurrying down the hallway, silken petticoats rustling like a silk banner in the wind. A turn to the right brought us to the cellar stairs. Down we hastened, and then across the cemented floor towards a long glass-fronted shelf pierced with steam pipes. "A match," she whispered breathlessly. I struck a wax match and touched it to the gas burner overhead. Never, never can I forget what that flood of gaslight revealed. In a row stood 5 large glass-mounted incubators. Behind the glass doors lay, in dormant majesty, 5 enormous eggs. The eggs were pale green, lighter somewhat than robin's eggs, but not as pale as heron's eggs. Each egg appeared to be larger than a large hogshead, and was partly embedded in bales of cotton wool. 5 little silver thermometers inside the glass doors indicated a temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit. I noticed that there was an automatic arrangement connected with the pipes, which regulated the temperature. I was too deeply moved for words. Speech seemed superfluous as we stood there, hand in hand, contemplating those gigantic pale green eggs. There is something in a silent egg which moves one's deeper emotions. Something solemn in its embryonic inertia, something awesome in its featureless immobility. I know of nothing on earth which is so totally lacking in expression as an egg. The great desert Sphinx, brooding through its veil of sand, has not that tremendous and meaningless dignity which wraps the colorless oval effort of a single domestic hen. I held the hand of the young countess very tightly. Her fingers closed slightly. Then and there, in the solemn presence of those emotionless eggs, I placed my arm around her supple waist and kissed her. She said nothing. Presently she stooped to observe the thermometer. Naturally, it registered 95 degrees Fahrenheit. "Suzanne," I said softly. "Oh, we must go upstairs," she whispered breathlessly. And picking up her silken skirts, she fled up the cellar stairs. I turned out the gas with that instinct of economy which early wastefulness has implanted in me, and followed the Countess Suzanne through the suite of rooms and into the small reception hall where she had first received me. She was sitting on a low divan, head bent, slowly turning a sapphire ring on her finger, round and round. I looked at her romantically, and then, "Please, don't," she said. The correct reply to this is, "Why not?" very tenderly spoken. "Because," she replied, which was also the correct and regular answer. "Suzanne," I said, slowly and passionately. She turned the sapphire ring on her finger. Presently she tired of this, so I lifted her passive hand very gently, and continued turning the sapphire ring on her finger, slowly, to harmonize with the cadence of our unspoken thoughts. Towards midnight I went home, walking with great care through a new street in Paris, paved exclusively with rose-colored blocks of air. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 12. At 9 o'clock in the evening, July 31st, 1900, the International Congress was to assemble in the great lecture hall of the Belgian Scientific Pavilion, which adjourned the Tasmanian Pavilion, to hear the Countess Suzanne d'Alzette read her paper on the Ux. That morning, the Countess and I, with 5 furniture vans, had transported the 5 great incubators to the platform of the lecture hall, and had engaged an army of plumbers and gas fitters to make the steam heating connections necessary to maintain in the incubators a temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit. A heavy green curtain hid the stage from the body of the lecture hall. Behind this curtain, the 5 enormous eggs reposed, each in its incubator. The Countess Suzanne was excited and calm by turns. Her cheeks were pink, her lips scarlet, her eyes bright as blue planets at midnight. Without faltering, she rehearsed her discourse before me, reading from her typewritten manuscript in a clear voice, in which I could scarcely discern a tremor. Then we went through the dumb show of exhibiting the Uxan eggs to a frantically applauding audience. She responded to countless supposititious encores, I leading her out repeatedly, before the green curtain, to face the great, damp, darkened auditorium. Then, in response to repeated imaginary recalls, she rehearsed the extemporaneous speech, thanking the distinguished audience for their patience in listening to an unknown confrere, and confessing her obligations to me, here I appeared and bowed in self-abasement, for my faith in her, and my aid in securing for her a public hearing before the most highly educated audience in the world. After that, we retired behind the curtain to sit on an empty box and eat sandwiches, and watch the last lingering plumbers pasting up the steam connections with a pot of molten lead. The plumbers were Americans, brought to Paris to make repairs on the American buildings during the Exposition, and we conversed with them affably as they pottered about, plumber-like, poking under the flooring with lighted candles, rubbing their thumbs up and down musty old pipes, and prying up planks in dark corners. They informed us that they were union men, and that they hoped we were too, and I replied that union was certainly my ultimate purpose, at which the young Countess smiled dreamily at vacancy. We did not dare leave the incubators. The plumbers lingered on, hour after hour, while we sat and watched the little silver thermometers, and waited. It was time for the Countess Suzanne to dress, and still the plumbers had not finished. so I sent a messenger for her maid to bring her trunk to the lecture hall, and I dispatched another messenger to my lodgings for my evening clothes and fresh linen. There were several dressing rooms off the stage. Here, about 6 o'clock, the Countess retired with her maid to dress, leaving me to watch the plumbers and the thermometers. When the Countess Suzanne returned, radiant and lovely in an evening gown of black lace, I gave her the roses I had brought for her, and hurried off to dress in my turn, leaving her to watch the thermometers. I was not absent more than half an hour, but when I returned I found the Countess anxiously conversing with the plumbers, and pointing despairingly at the thermometers, which now registered only 95 degrees. "You must keep up the temperature," I said. "Those eggs are due to hatch within a few hours. What's the trouble with the heat?" The plumber did not know, but thought the connections were defective. "But that's why we called you in," exclaimed the Countess. "Can't you fix things securely?" "Oh, we'll fix things, lady," replied the plumber condescendingly, and he ambled away to rub his thumb up and down a pipe. As we alone were unable to move and handle the enormous eggs, the Countess, whose sweet character was a stranger to vindictiveness or petty resentment, had written to the members of the Ornithological Committee, revealing the marvelous fortune which had crowned her efforts in the search for evidence to sustain her theory concerning the uks, and inviting these gentlemen to aid her in displaying the great eggs to the assembled Congress. This she had done the night previous. Every one of the gentlemen invited had come post-haste to her hotel, to view the eggs with their own skeptical and astonished eyes, and the fair young Countess and I tasted our first triumph in her cellar, whither we conducted Sir Peter Grebe, the Crown Prince of Monaco, Baron de Becos, and His Majesty King Christian of Finland. Skepticism and incredulity gave place to excitement and unbounded enthusiasm. The old king embraced the Countess. Baron de Becos attempted to kiss me. Sir Peter Grebe made a handsome apology for his folly, and vowed that he would do open penance for his sins. The poor Crown Prince, who was of a nervous temperament, sat on the cellar stairs and wept like a child. His grief at his own pig-headedness touched us all profoundly. So it happened that these gentlemen were coming tonight to give their aid to us in moving the priceless eggs, and lend their countenance and enthusiastic support to the young Countess in her maiden effort. Sir Peter Grebe arrived first, all covered with orders and decorations, and greeted us affectionately, calling the Countess the sweetest lass in France, and me his undutiful Yankee cousin who had landed feet foremost at the expense of the British Empire. The King of Finland, the Crown Prince, and Baron de Becos arrived together, a composite mass of medals, sashes, and Academy palms. To see them moving boxes about, straightening chairs, and pulling out rugs reminded me of those golden-embroidered gentlemen who run out into the arena and roll up carpets after the acrobats have finished their turn in the Nouveau Cirque. I was aiding the King of Finland to move a heavy keg of nails, when the Countess called out to me in alarm, saying that the thermometers had dropped to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I spoke sharply to the plumbers, who were standing in a circle behind the dressing rooms, but they answered sullenly that they could do no more work that day. Indignant and alarmed, I ordered them to come out to the stage, and after some hesitation they filed out, a sulky, silent lot of workmen, with their tools already gathered up and tied in their kits. At once I noticed that a new man had appeared among them, a red-faced, stocky man wearing a frock coat and a shiny silk hat. "Who is the workmaster here?" I asked. "I am," said a man in blue overalls. "Well," said I, "why don't you fix those steam fittings?" There was a silence. The man in the silk hat smirked. "Well," said I. Come, that's all right," said the man in the silk hat. "These men know their business without you telling them." "Who are you?" I demanded sharply. "Oh, I'm just a walking delegate," he replied with a sneer. "There's a strike in New York, and I come over here to tie this here exposition up, see?" "You mean to say you won't let these men finish their work?" I asked, thunderstruck. "That's about it, young man," he said coolly. Furious, I glanced at my watch, then at the thermometers, which now registered only 75 degrees. Already I could hear the first comers of the audience arriving in the body of the hall. Already a stagehand was turning up the footlights and dragging chairs and tables hither and thither. "What will you take to stay and attend to those steam pipes?" I demanded desperately. "It can't be done nohow," observed the man in the silk hat. "That New York strike is good for a month yet." Then, turning to the workmen, he nodded, and to my horror, the whole gang filed out after him, turning deaf ears to my entreaties and threats. There was a deathly silence. Then Sir Peter exploded into a vivid shower of words. The Countess, pale as a ghost, gave me a heartbreaking look. The Crown Prince wept. "Great heaven!" I cried. "The thermometers have fallen to 70 degrees!" The King of Finland sat down on a chair and pressed his hands over his eyes. Baron Delegates ran round and round, uttering subdued and plaintive screams. Sir Peter swore steadily. "Gentlemen," I cried desperately, "we must save those eggs. They are on the very eve of hatching. Who will volunteer?" "To do what?" moaned the Crown Prince. "I'll show you," I exclaimed, running to the incubators and beckoning to the Baron to aid me. In a moment we had rolled out the great egg, made a nest on the stage floor with the bales of cotton wool, and placed the egg in it. One after another we rolled out the remaining eggs, building for each its nest of cotton. And at last the 5 enormous eggs lay there in a row behind the green curtain. "Now," said I excitedly to the king, "you must get up on that egg and try to keep it warm." The king began to protest, but I would take no denial, and presently his majesty was perched up on the great egg, gazing foolishly about at the others, who were now all climbing up on their allotted eggs. "Great heaven!" muttered the king, as Sir Peter settled down comfortably on his egg. "I am willing to give life and fortune for the sake of science, but I can't bear to hatch out eggs like a bird." The Crown Prince was now sitting patiently beside the Baron Delegates. "I feel in my bones," he murmured, "that I'm about to hatch something. Can't you hear a tapping on the shell of your egg, Baron?" "Parbleu!" replied the Baron. "The shell is moving under me." It certainly was. For the next moment the Baron fell into his egg with a crash and a muffled shriek, and floundered out, tripping, yellow as a canary. "N'importe!" he cried excitedly. "Allons, save the eggs! Hurrah! Vive la science!" And he scrambled up on the 4th egg, and sat there, arms folded, sublime courage transfiguring him from head to foot. We all gave him a cheer, which was hushed as the stage manager ran in, warning us that the audience was already assembled and in place. "You're not going to raise the curtain while we're sitting, are you?" demanded the King of Finland anxiously. No, I said. "Sit tight, your majesty. Courage, gentlemen. Our vindication is at hand." The Countess glanced at me with startled eyes. I took her hand, saluted it respectfully, and then quietly led her before the curtain, facing an ocean of upturned faces across the flaring footlights. She stood a moment to acknowledge the somewhat ragged applause, a calm smile on her lips. All her courage had returned. I saw that at once. Very quietly she touched her lips to the eau sucrée, laid her manuscript on the table, raised her beautiful head, and began. "That the ox is a living bird, I am here before you to prove." A sharp report behind the curtain drowned her voice. She paled. The audience rose amid cries of excitement. "What was it?" she asked faintly. "Sir Peter has hatched out his egg," I whispered. "Hark, there goes another egg." And I ran behind the curtain. Such a scene as I beheld was never dreamed of on land or sea. 2 enormous young oxen, all over gigantic pin feathers, were wandering stupidly about. Mounted on one was Sir Peter Grebe, eyes starting from his apoplectic visage. On the other, clinging to the bird's neck, hung the Baron de Bécas. Before I could move, the 2 remaining eggs burst, and a pair of huge scrawny fledglings rose among the debris, bearing off on their backs the king and crown prince. "Help!" said the King of Finland faintly. "I'm falling off." I sprang to his aid, but tripped on the curtain spring. The next instant the green curtain shot up, and there, revealed to that vast and distinguished audience, roamed 4 enormous chicks, bearing on their backs the most respected and exclusive aristocracy of Europe. The Countess Suzanne turned with a little shriek of horror, then sat down in her chair, laid her lovely head on the table, and very quietly fainted away, unconscious of the frantic cheers which went roaring to the roof. This, then, is the true history of the famous Exposition scandal. And as I have said, had it not been for the presence in that audience of 2 American reporters, nobody would have known what all the world now knows. Nobody would have read of the marvelous feats of bareback riding indulged in by the King of Finland. Nobody would have read how Sir Peter Grebe steered his mount safely past the footlights, only to come to grief over the prompter's box. But this is scandal. And as for the charming Countess Suzanne d'Alzette, the public has heard all that it is entitled to hear, and much that it is not entitled to hear. However, on second thoughts, perhaps the public is entitled to hear a little more. I will therefore say this much. The shock of astonishment which stunned me when the curtain flew up, revealing the king-bestridden oxen, was nothing to the awful blow which smote me, when the Count d'Alzette leapt from the orchestra over the footlights, and bore away with him the fainting form of his wife, the lovely Countess d'Alzette. I sometimes wonder, but as I have repeatedly observed, this dull and pedantic narrative of fact is no vehicle for sentimental soliloquy. It is, then, merely sufficient to say that I took the earliest steamer for kinder shores, spurred on to haste by a venomous cablegram from the Smithsonian repudiating me, and by another from Bronx Park ordering me to spend the winter in some inexpensive, poisonous, and unobtrusive spot, and make a collection of isopods. The island of Java appeared to me to be as poisonously unobtrusive and inexpensive a region as I had ever heard of. A steamer sailed from Antwerp for Batavia in 24 hours. Therefore, as I say, I took the night train for Brussels, and the steamer from Antwerp the following evening. Of my uneventful voyage, of the happy and successful quest, there is little to relate. The Javanese are frolicsome and hospitable. There was a girl there with features that were as delicate as though chiseled out of palest amber, and I remember she wore a most wonderful jeweled helmet-like headdress, and jingling bangles on her ankles, and when she danced she made most graceful and poetic gestures with her supple wrists. But that has nothing to do with isopods, absolutely nothing. Letters from home came occasionally. Professor Farrago had returned to the Bronx, and had been re-elected to the high office he had so nobly held when I first became associated with him. Through his kindness, and by his advice, I remained for several years in the Far East, until a letter from him arrived, recalling me, and also announcing his own hurried and sudden departure for Florida. He also mentioned my promotion to the office of sub-curator of department. So I started on my homeward voyage, very much pleased with the world, and arrived in New York on April 1st, 1904, ready for a rest to which I believed myself entitled. And the first thing that they handed me was a letter from Professor Farrago summoning me south. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 13. The letter that started me, I was going to say startled me, but only imaginative people are startled. The letter, then, that started me from Bronx Park to the south, I print without the permission of my superior, Professor Farrago. I have not obtained his permission for the somewhat exciting reason that nobody knows where he is. Publicity being now recognized as the annihilator of mysteries, a benevolent purpose alone inspires me to publish a letter so strange, so pathetically remarkable, in view of what has recently occurred. As I say, I had only just returned from Java with a valuable collection of undescribed isopods, an order of Edriophthalmus crustaceans with 7 free thoracic somites furnished with 14 legs. And I beg my reader's pardon, but my reader will see the necessity for the author's absolute accuracy in insisting on detail, because the story that follows is a dangerous story for a scientist to tell, in view of the vast amount of nonsense and fiction in circulation, masquerading as stories of scientific adventure. I was, therefore, anticipating a delightful summer's work with pen and microscope, when on April 1st I received the following extraordinary letter from Professor Farrago. In camp, Little Sprite Lake, Everglades, Florida, March 15th, 1902. My dear Mr. Gilland, on receipt of this communication, you will immediately secure for me the following articles. 1 complete outfit of woman's clothing. 1 camera. 1 light steel cage, large enough for you to stand in. 1 stenographer, male sex. 1 5-pound steel tank with siphon and hose attachment. 1 rifle and ammunition. 3 ounces rhosium oxide. 1 ounce chlorate strontium. You will then, within 24 hours, set out with the stenographer and the supplies mentioned, and join me in camp on Little Sprite Lake. This order is formal and admits of no delay. You will appreciate the necessity of absolute and unquestioning obedience when I tell you that I am practically on the brink of the most astonishing discovery recorded in natural history, since Monsieur Zani discovered the purple-spotted Zumbach in Nyanza, and that I depend upon you and your zeal and fidelity for success. I dare not, lest my letter fall into unscrupulous hands, convey to you more than a hint of what lies before us in these uncharted solitudes of the Everglades. You must read between the lines when I say that because one can see through a sheet of glass, The glass is nonetheless solid and palpable. One can see through it, if that is also seeing it, but one can nevertheless hold it and feel it and receive from it sensations of cold or heat according to its temperature. Certain jellyfish are absolutely transparent when in the water, and one can only know of their presence by accidental contact, not by sight. Have you ever thought that possibly there might exist larger and more highly organized creatures, transparent to eyesight, yet palpable to touch? Little Sprite Lake is the jumping-off place. Beyond lie the Everglades, the outskirts of which are haunted by the Seminoles, the interior of which have never been visited by man, as far as we know. As you are aware, no general survey of Florida has yet been made. There exist no maps of the Everglades south of Okeechobee. Even Little Sprite Lake is but a vague blot on our maps. We know, of course, that south of the 11,000 miles of fresh water which is called Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades form a vast delta-like projection of thousands and thousands of square miles. Darkest Africa is no longer a mystery, but the Everglades today remain the somber secret of our continent. And today, this unknown expanse of swamps, barrens, forests, and lagoons is greater than in the days of De Soto, because the entire region has been slowly rising. All this, my dear sir, you already know, and I ask your indulgence for recalling the facts to your memory. I do it for this reason. The search for what I am seeking may lead us to utter destruction, and therefore my formal orders to you should be modified to this extent. Do you volunteer? If you volunteer, my orders remain. If not, turn this letter over to Mr. Kingsley, who will find for me the companion I require. In the event of your coming, you must break your journey at False Cape and ask for an old man named Slunk. He will give you a packet. You will give him $1 and drive on to Cape Canaveral, and you will do what is to be done there. From there to Fort Kissimmee, to Okeechobee, traversing the lake to the Rita River, where I have marked the trail to Little Sprite. At Little Sprite, I shall await you. Beyond that point, a merciful Providence alone can know what awaits us. Yours fraternally, Farrago. P.S. I think that you had better make your will, and suggest the same idea to the stenographer who is to accompany you. F. And that was the letter I received while seated comfortably on the floor of my workroom, surrounded by innocent isopods, all patiently awaiting scientific investigation. And this is what I did. Within 24 hours, I had assembled the supplies required: the cage, the woman's clothing, tank, arms and ammunition, and the chemicals. I had secured accommodations for that evening on the Florida, Volusia, and Fort Lauderdale Railway as far as Citron City. And I had been interviewing stenographers all day long, the result of an innocently worded advertisement in the daily newspapers. It was now very close to the time when I must summon a cab and drive to the ferry, and yet I was still shy one stenographer. I had seen scores. They simply would not listen to the proposition. "Why does a gentleman in the backwoods of Florida want a stenographer?" they demanded, and as I had not the faintest idea, I could only say so. I think the majority interviewed concluded I had escaped from a state institution. As the time for departure approached, I became desperate, urging and beseeching applicants to accompany me. But neither sympathy for my instant need nor desire for salary moved them. I waited until the last moment, hoping against hope. Then, with a groan of despair, I seized luggage and raincoat, made for the door, and flung it open, only to find myself face to face with an attractive young girl, apparently on the point of pressing the electric button. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I have a train to catch." She was noticeably attractive in her storm coat and pretty hat, and I really was sorry. So sorry that I added, "I have about 27 seconds to place at your service before I go." "20 will be sufficient," she replied pleasantly. "I saw your advertisement for a stenographer." "We require a man," I interposed hastily. "Have you engaged him?" "No." We looked at each other. "You wouldn't accept anyway," I began. "How do you know?" "You wouldn't leave town, would you?" "Yes, if you required it." "What? Go to Florida?" "Yes, if I must." "But think of the alligators! Think of the snakes! Big bitey snakes!" "Gracious!" she exclaimed, eyes growing bigger. "Indians, too! Unreconciled sulky Seminoles! Fevers! Mud puddles! Spiders! And only $50 a week!" I'll go," she stammered. "Go?" I repeated grimly. "Then you've exactly 2 3/4 seconds left for preparations." Instinctively, she raised her little gloved hand and patted her hair. "I'm ready," she said unsteadily. "1 extra second to make your will," I added, stunned by her self-possession. I have nothing to leave, nobody to leave it to," she said, smiling. "I am ready." I took that extra second myself for a lightning course in reflection upon effects and consequences. "It's silly, it's probably murder," I said, "but you're engaged. Now we must run for it." And that is how I came to engage the services of Miss Helen Barrison, a stenographer. End of chapter 13.